Good evening, everybody, to the Sandbox Debate Club. We're going to have a really good philosophical debate. This one is on the debate about moral realism. So we have John Fisher and Jmike, and they're going to be arguing their positions. John is going to be taking the affirmative here for a moral realist viewpoint, more of a philosophical, naturalistic grounding for morals. J. Mike is going to be taking the opposite position, so he'll be defending his view from John's view, of course. And so the way we're going to set this up, we're going to have a 10-minute opening, a 5-minute rebuttal. Then we're going to go into open conversation for 10 minutes. For another 10 minutes, we're going to be doing a Q&A. So guys, go ahead and get your questions lined up as we go through this so we can have them lined up for the Q&A session. And then, of course, we'll have the 5-minute closing at the end. I did want to give a special shout out to everyone behind the scenes, Sonny Shell, Wes, who's the producer. We have our Patreon contributors, our audience. Thank you guys for being here. And, without further delay, we want to get right down to it. We want to get into the discussion and the debate. So we're going to go ahead and start with John Fisher, and we're going to do our 10-minute opening, please.
Anywhere you go, you belong.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the hosts of this debate. I'd also like to thank Jmike for being my worthy adversary for this discussion. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for taking an interest. So the position I will be defending is what's called moral realism. And more specifically, I'm not going to be tied to one specific sort of moral realism. I think that there are many theories which are defensible, but the form I'm going to defend is a form of divine command theory, one that roots goodness as being the essence of God, and one which then goes to have a normative ethic based upon God's commands. By normative ethic, I mean a theory of obligation. It's what binds you to do one thing over another thing. And by God's essence as the grounding of goodness, I mean that whatever it is to be God, whatever God is in and of himself, if we were to know God's essence, we would think, yeah, that is the good. And we know this not by direct observation, but rather by indirect inference. And I'll get to that a little later. But for now, that is kind of a sketch of the main theory. So, what is moral realism? Moral realism is the view that there are moral propositions about what we ought to do, and these propositions are true and false, and they are true and false in respect of something which is objective in the world, namely God's essence. Now, when we speak of things which are true and false, what we mean is that we have propositions or statements about them. An example of a non moral type would be this water bottle is blue. Now, that's a statement that can be true or false. If I was holding it up and I said this water bottle was green, that statement would be false. In the same way, we have moral propositions. A moral proposition would be, and just to use a very serious example, it is wrong to dismember babies for fun. So if you had a baby and you thought, you know what, maybe I should take apart its legs and its arms, see it crying, that would be the wrong thing to do. That's a proposition. I'm saying it's wrong, and that proposition would be true, and it would be true independent of human desire. Not just human desire, but desire regardless. So it needs to be emphasized here when I say that it's grounded in God's essence and what it means to be God. I don't mean that God has a sort of control or desire over what he is. If God is omnipotent, for example, God is all powerful. If he wanted to, he couldn't think, I want to be less than powerful. Or if God wanted to not know something, then God could not change that fact about him. Those would be necessary truths and truths that would be maintained in any possible world. Now, with that out of the way, what do we get from how do we show that moral realism is true? Well, first off, let's go with the phenomenon. So we have to make a distinction between the phenomenon, our experiences, And we also have to make a distinction between the story we want to tell, which explains the experience. So we have experiences of um, certain events that cause us to be morally outraged or to praise the person. So, for example, if I save the life of another human being, that's praiseworthy. If I was to dismember a baby for fun, I am pretty sure Scott would never invite me to these debates ever again, and understandably so. And how do we show that the phenomenon is true? Well, I would say that morality would concern a domain of knowledge or truths that are properly basic. That is to say, they don't need further justification. Now, how would I show that? Well, I think that a great example or analogy would be something like the laws of non-contradiction or the basic laws of logic. So the great Muslim thinker Avicenna once said, if anyone denies the law of non-contradiction, we should beat him and burn him until he agrees that to be beaten is not the same thing as to not be beaten, and to be burned is not the same thing as to not be burned. Now, he's not actually saying we should threaten people like Graham Priest. But what he is saying is it just seems so obvious that you wouldn't really need a way of justifying it. You just start off like this. Well, what can we honestly say to the moral non realist, the moral nihilist, or the moral skeptic? Well, should we not say with Avicenna something similar, like anyone who denies moral truths should be beaten and burned until he agrees that he ought not to be beaten and he ought not to be burned? Of course, you could explain it in a different way using human preference and something like that, but that doesn't really seem to cut it. Like, we really seem to suggest that when we see people doing morally outrageous things, it's not just a matter of difference, like whether or not we want pineapples on pizza, although those are disgusting, not gonna lie. We rather want to say that, yes, you ought not to do this. You ought not to dismember babies. You ought not to hurt innocent people for fun. Uh, Basic propositions we would think that they don't really need any further justification. As to why I think God is the best grounding of it, it's because we seem to have personal relations with these various moral beliefs. So, for example, I seem to have personal obligations to myself. If I was to get caught denying the truth of some matter and even lying to myself, then that would seem to pick at my very own conscience. And it doesn't really seem to be an obligation I have to other people, but it's rather I know I have one to myself. And I feel guilty about going against truth. Well, it's not any human being I feel guilty against. I think the best explanation is someone like God, a personal agent, not something that's abstract like a Platonic truth, but rather someone very personal. So that's why I think something like a divine command theory or the divine essence is probably the best grounding for it. And with that, I'll sketch. That would be a sketch of my basic belief on moral realism, a sort of justification from proper basicality that I hope Jmike will respond to. And with that, I yield the rest of my time.
All right. Thank you for framing your position. And I look so forward to seeing the response that J Mike has. So, needless to say, we're just going to go ahead and let J Mike have his opening 10-minute opening. So, you go right ahead, J Mike. And you're muted.
It wouldn't be an episode with Jmike if I wasn't muted while I started talking. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the topic. I appreciate the considerations John has listed. I in my opening statement, there's some aspects of things that I don't know. I didn't know John's position beforehand. I do think it's a little bit more tangible than I was questionable about. So hopefully we can kind of see where we align on that, and then the aspects of moral Platonism maybe we can elucidate further, since that's not necessarily in my opening statement. But yeah, so I'm going to more so address John's position as a moral realist in virtue of him being a theist, and how you ground independent moral facts in that domain. I take a position that moral realism is an incoherent meta-ethical thesis in virtue of an issue of grounding mind-independent normative facts. Moral facts are non-negotiably normative in that they concern themselves with what is good and a standard at which we achieve that goal. It should be noted that normative properties cannot be constituted by mere descriptive properties. And this is a point in relation to logic known as the Izot gap or Hume's guillotine. I started to stop in the middle of it, but somebody's mic isn't muted, and I can hear myself echoing, and I can hear them. If they could mute their mic. Thank you. I appreciate that. So moral facts are non-negotiably normative in that they concern themselves with what is good and the standard at which achieves that goal. And it should be noted that normative properties cannot be constituted by mere descriptive properties. And what I mean by that is it's a point in relation to logic known as the Izot gap or Hume's guillotine. To break it down, there's a fundamental distinction between normative and descriptive claims. If one is going to state premise 1, smoking causes cancer, which is descriptive, and conclude that we ought not smoke, a normative standard, we are smuggling at a value that isn't subsumed in the premise, thus isn't valid. When reading the premise whose value aligns with a careless life will reject the normative conclusion that they ought not smoke. In fact, they would argue that they ought to smoke in order to achieve that normative goal of a careless life. A further point is to add that no additional amount of the descriptive premises. So if we're going to add, maybe we can just add 1,000 descriptive premises that justify that value. It's not going to actually get you to an ability to constitute the normative standard. And the way that I kind of like to relate this is that the same way you try to add a plethora of descriptive premises that don't concern philosophers, well, they can't possibly constitute concluding something about philosophers, and they can't add the additional normative fact about how philosophers ought to conduct philosophy. The only way that you can make the initial argument valid is to add a qualifying normative premise that you ought to care about your health. And once that's accepted, the conclusion deductively follows, because the other agent that decides that they don't care about their health can reject premise 3 and reject the conclusion that should follow. Now, clearly, this is a major issue for moral naturalism, in that moral facts alone cannot be synonymous with normative facts. And many theists seem to think that this isn't a problem for God, but I don't see how it's not a mere naturalistic fallacy to assess descriptive facts about God's nature and conclude that they, in and of themselves, can ground categorical imperatives. The fact that God is powerful, for example, would be a mere descriptor that can't actually ground the normativity, the same way that a natural fact of the world can't. So first, there's something to be said about the view that concludes God's nature is actually amoral, so that the good is just derived from his divine commands. We couldn't say that God has some good reason to command X is wrong if we were to look at his nature, because it's in fact amoral in this case. So this creates a scenario where the good supposedly rests in virtue of the command. But if we're going to look closely, it just makes the command arbitrary if there's no explanation of in virtue of what authority makes God's commands the right commands. There would be no inconsistency to posit some other God within an immoral nature that just commands evil. Just looking to its nature in this case can't explain the good. Like we said, it's immoral, and the command is still left to either be evil or good because nothing elucidates the mind-independent property, thus leaving as an arbitrary command, in which the power of God can't be used to impute the power of normativity because it is descriptive. Furthermore, a command in and of itself can't be the source of normativity because it's inherently desire-driven. The idea that commands somehow untethers itself from mind dependency is just to ignore what it means to issue a command, as it's to be in accord with some goal, and that goal being dependent on desire or an intentional state. How can desires or intentions of the God be mind independent? I'm not sure how the theist thinks that they can cash out what are obviously mind-dependent desires that influence or instantiate the supposed categorical norms. Worse, this is just to ignore what it means to be objective, and in fact reduces it to a subjective meta-ethical thesis dependent upon some subject's nature or desires. So another way I've tried to see theists cash this out is to say that good is God's nature, and that this is some a posteriori consideration after the fact. But this still appears to commit the same naturalistic fallacy that mere descriptions about God's nature can somehow ground mind-independent moral facts. More importantly, this raises a new dilemma, avoiding the former. Are properties of God's nature good by virtue of the fact that they rest within God? Again, this will just collapse into arbitrariness. An evil God, after all, could look to his nature, and then it's entirely on a par. On the other side, this is to take the other horn. Does God have its nature because it's in conformity with the good? This again is just to admit to a standard independent of God. So even if we analyze the usual attempt to escape the Euthyphro, which is to claim that God is, or that good is God's nature, we are still left with breaking down the dilemma as I proposed. Are properties of God's nature good in virtue of the fact that they rest within God? Or does God have a nature because it is in conformity with the good? Even if I'm to strip this all away and scope in on what it means to have mind-independent duty, absent a God, I'm still left with the question of what the ontology of mind-independent moral facts looks like and how we can even come to the right analysis of it. It doesn't have a coherent basis from my perspective to state that there are independent reasons untethered to your desires or aims. It seems to avoid a causal referent from the agent to the independent duty supposed. For example, let's just say that you saw a kid being abducted and you successfully stopped the kidnapper and saved the kid. Upon receiving acclaim for your actions, would it be a coherent statement when responding with why you risked your life to save the kid that you recognize some mind-independent moral duty? What would that even look like as opposed to the mind-dependent desire that drives you based on the values you've developed? Why would we rest our head on a thesis that posits more ontological assumptions than it struggles to cash out? Regardless of the potential methodological utility, one thinks in discussing moral language this way, mind-independent moral facts lack an ontological basis and are just epistemically unjustified.
All right, very good. So Jmike is coming back strong with the is-ought gap and challenging John to fill in that gap and explain how you can derive moral facts from non-moral facts in nature. And obviously, John's going to be rooting his morality in God, which is his fundamental premise of his morality. But then Jmike's bringing up things like the naturalistic fallacy and things of that nature. So it'd be very interesting to see how we're going to unpack these concepts and see if these categories are related in any way, if we can connect these categories together, and if not, and see how this falls out. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go into the 5-minute rebuttal for each of our interlocutors. So John will be next to go ahead and rebut what Jmike has just laid out in his defense. So let's go in.
All right, so that was a very strong opening. Now, I did take some notes, and let's see if I can't get all the objections that Jmike was so nice to lay out for us. So the first one was normative properties cannot be grounded in descriptive properties. So this does go back to Hume's is-ought gap. Now, is this a problem specifically for moral naturalism? Well, even more specifically, a theistic divine command theory and at more of wider range of moral naturalism. This is considered to be one of the toughest objections, but I think it isn't insurmountable. So if we have a proposition like causing murder is wrong, that's our conclusion. But how do we get there? Well, if something causes me to be unhappy, I shouldn't do it. Murder causes me to be unhappy, therefore I shouldn't do it. Well, how do we exactly get from the fact that something causes me to be unhappy to we ought not to do it? That's the gap that Hume lays out. Well, that is considered to be a very interesting issue. I don't think it's insurmountable because there's a difference between logical possibility and metaphysical possibility. So logical possibility is grounded in a semantics of language. So, for example, if I was to say all bachelors are unmarried, John is a bachelor, therefore John is unmarried, that's true by definition because I know I'm not married. That's a truth about the world. But the first proposition, if John is unmarried, then he's a bachelor, that is a semantic truth. That deals with logical possibility. And that's true in all possible worlds, purely on the language alone. So yeah, if you're a moral naturalist and you have a premise like that and you're trying to make a deduction, then yeah, you are sneaking it in. But that's not actually the grounding of, that's not necessarily what a moral naturalist is committed to. Metaphysical possibility is a bit different. So, for example, if I was to say that my desk is white all over, well, that's a truth. But if I was to say nothing can be white all over and red all over, well, there's nothing about red that means non-white. Those are those aren't equivalent terms. So if I was to say nothing can be white all over and red all over, my desk is white all over, therefore it cannot be red all over. That's a deduction. That's metaphysically true, and it's grounded in a way that isn't based on those semantics. So how do we get? So can we do that similarly with God's essence? And then the conclusion. Well, I think we can. So we know that moral truths exist based on the fact that they're properly basic, but why are we going to say that God is going to serve as the best explanation? Well, that's because of an argument I laid out earlier as it comes to not a deductive truth, but rather the fact that God is personal and he is the best explanation thus far. So that first proposition isn't grounded in some sort of hard a priori belief, but rather it's a metaphysical truth that I think is well inferred by our moral experiences, especially in terms of reflecting on the fact of what happens when we feel guilty about doing certain things or actions. So I don't think that's snuck into the premise. Now, another objection that was laid out was what makes God's command good? Well, as I laid out earlier, it is grounded in his essence or his nature, and that is mind independent. So, for example, it is a mind independent fact that water is the equivalent of H2O. Now, there is no such thing as water that is also not H2O, and that's something we know from our best science. And likewise, we also know that God has an essence, something which he is always in any possible world. And God's essence is just intrinsically desirable, and it is something which everyone ought to desire or ought to want. And that's just a truth that it's a good onto its goodness onto itself. And now we don't know what God's essence is. So how exactly can we verify that? Well, that I would ground in a more practical, you can make a practical argument, which is something I've done in the past, which is, well, we know that there needs to be something that bridges our own personal happiness and also our personal duties that we know from reflecting on these moral situations. And since God is the best justification for that, ergo, we posit God as our and his essence as our best explanatory hypothesis that can bridge this gap. And with that, I recognize my time is up. So, sorry, a bit tired.
All right, Jmike, you're up to respond, sir.
You're good. So a lot of this maybe for me I'm always terrible at remembering everything people say. I tried to jot things down, so maybe there's things I miss that John can elucidate during like a discussion. I'll work a little bit backwards. Hopefully this isn't incoherent. When you talk about let me start from the front. If you talk about logical and metaphysical possibilities, this might be a separate thing. I'm not sure how metaphysical possibility just doesn't collapse into logical possibility, especially if you're just skeptical of certain metaphysical considerations, which I would say like a good portion of the audience or certain people that would watch this perhaps would be. And they might just derive that the logical possibility is really going to instantiate what is also metaphysically possible if descriptions of logic are accurate to reality to that sense, especially something like, A equals A, right? That's just a description of the behavior of reality. And that logical possibility is in a mere accordance with the metaphysical possibility. That might be a different point to address, or maybe something that I'm not fully grasping where you're coming from. But the one thing I'm worried about when you say descriptions from white to red, it seems that you're treating descriptions as descriptions, but not categorical ought. So I'm not sure what the analogous like referent is to that, because to me, like, sure, think I could derive certain descriptions about other descriptions. But even then, there's like a logical point to say that if I have descriptions about philosopher, or let's say I have descriptions about some phenomena or concrete items that aren't philosophers, and then I conclude something about philosophers, it would just appear invalid, right? Because we just like where does the conclusion? How does that deductively derive that we conclude descriptive assessments about philosophers if we didn't have descriptive assessments about philosophers, let alone concluding about like a normative categorical ought about how we ought to conduct philosophy or something like that. So again, that might be a point that you might have to elucidate on that I'm not digesting. The thing that stands out to me the most is talking about God is personal and like a metaphysical truth inferred by moral experiences. Well, slavery goes against. I was never a Christian in my life ever, and so slavery has always gone against my moral intuition that is wrong, right? That I think morals are desire dependent, but dependent upon my desires and my intentional state. That is something that's wrong to me. So if my intuition is not grounded or not able to be inferred the same metaphysical truth that you do, then we're just relying on intuition. And I don't know that if we reduce explanations to intuition, that's going to be satisfactory or just justificatory, because we could do that with pretty much any concept in philosophy and just say, well, it's just some intuition that I have. But it doesn't seem to have any motivational force to convince your interlocutor. And then if we say, what makes God's command good, and you say it's grounded in his nature, I'm still left with, and these are questions that I want to propose very specifically, so I want to get the right wording. I'm not sure how you go from if the good is God's nature, you're left with, because the way that I look at that is when someone says the good is God's nature, it's a way to avoid the kind of Euthyphro dilemma and to say like, hey, well, the good is God's nature. And we kind of come to that on a posteriori considerations. But then it just leaves you with the same dilemma or similar dilemma of, are the property of God's nature good in virtue of the fact that they're within God? Because if that's the case, there's nothing different about an evil God looking to its nature and commanding similarly based in virtue of its nature. Right? There's nothing that elucidates whether the fact that it's good because it's just instantiated as some command or some insight to its nature. And then on the other horn, it's this issue of if it has the nature because it's in conformity with the good, which is the only other option, well, then it's just arbitrary. It's just independent of God, and we don't even need God. And I guess I would conclude there, and maybe we can, John can assess things he has confusion about what I said or things that he wants to address specifically.
Okay, perfect. So, it looks like the open conversation will be a good space to work these sort of questions out and understand exactly what we mean by different things and really make this really clear. Mm-hmm. Before we go into the 10-minute open conversation, I just wanted to give a real quick shout out to the folks I see in the chat. My good friend James is tired, Brain Bug, KCA Randy, Brute Facts, Theoretically, The Awoken One, Just Questions. We have Joshua out there. So many people are really getting involved in this show, and that's really, really making me happy to see that there's such a big interest in philosophical debate and thought, and it's something that is a passion for me, and I'm sure everybody else. So without further ado, let's get into the 10-minute open conversation.
Before we get into the conversation, I would just like to give Wes a shout out for the sick beats he's been dropping between. Those are very nice.
Well, maybe let me give a shout out too before we get into the discourse as well, real quick, is to say I appreciate John. It needs to be noted, and I said this before, that he's taking the affirmative, which is something that I always really respect, because you can always take the affirmative on any standpoint, and so So that's something I want to respect just out the gate. That said, because you're taking the affirmative, maybe I can now take advantage of you in this sense.
Fair enough.
Let's kind of start from the basis and break it down. So how do you think we access normative facts?
Right. So I think normative facts are accessed in a couple of ways. The first one I think is divine revelation. So I would say that that's mostly tied into my religious beliefs. But those aren't accessible to everybody, and there have been, and not everyone's a Christian. So I think that those are notes of special revelation. But I think the typical way of doing it is mostly by the moral law within, or our moral intuitions and our conscience. So basically something we're designed with that's fallible, just like a lot of our other senses are fallible, but still I think gives us good reason and justification to believe in them.
Okay, so the qualifier you said about fallible was kind of where I was leading to initially. So I was my first response, there's two parts that I would want to respond to. One is you say divine revelation. I'm wondering, like, you wouldn't, especially with the additional qualifier of fallible, you probably wouldn't say there's no contradiction that God could reveal, could deceive you in what moral facts actually are. That let's say in virtue of what you think a moral fact is true, it's actually false.
Right. So that is true. I don't think that God can do that. So God couldn't say, so God couldn't give you a true special revelation that said, I don't know. So here's one I'll just use an example. He couldn't give you a divine revelation that said, it's perfectly all right to worship other gods and put them before me. So God couldn't do that.
Okay, so I want to catch this out a little bit. The way I've heard some other theists say is that he can't, like, primarily deceive you, but he can deceive you secondarily through, like, contingent facts about the world or something.
Like can you leave? Oh yeah, so like he can leave you to be deceived. Like if God just takes his hands off the wheel, so to speak, and say, John's going to be deceived and he's just not going to get this thing down right. I'm just not going to intervene. Like he could do that. He doesn't owe me special revelation or anything like that. But if he does do it, it's an act of grace and mercy, and he's fully free to either do that or to not do that. But what he doesn't do is he causes me to be deceived, or he causes me to experience some sort of lie.
Okay, so because the way I'm looking at this is from the initial question is how you access normative facts, and if the answer is divine revelation, I'm wondering, could he not give you a revelation at which, in virtue of the normative facts, are actually the, like, truth aptness is actually just false?
Oh, are you saying could he give me like a divine revelation that's false? Like
more specifically about normative facts, right? So like we could say there's like natural facts at which he could reveal to you that are false, but I'm specifically saying
he could not.
Are there normative facts at which he could reveal to you that are just the opposite of the truth value at which is ascribed?
No, he couldn't. So he couldn't give me a command that says you ought not to put other gods before me, and have that be false. If it's comes from God, that's a true, and I'm not supposed to have gods before him. That's true.
Okay, so the good would be God's nature, and we would come to that as an a posteriori consideration.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so then that leaves me to like a splitting of the question to say, what I said in my opening statement is are the property of God's nature good in virtue of the fact that they rest within God, or is it good because it's in conformity with, or I'm sorry, is God's nature in conformity with the good?
Oh, well, all right. So I would say that God's nature is just the good. You don't reduce it down any further. So here's kind of an example. So think of like the color red. You don't reduce that down to, you can't really reduce the experience of seeing the quality of red any further than that. It's just redness. So yeah, and unfortunately, we do not have any idea of what God's essence is in and of itself. So, are you familiar with the whole Mary's room
Well, I am, and that was what I was going to say was like, a reductive physicalist would probably disagree and say that there are physical facts at which they could reduce, but there, for example, my co-host Cease is a non-reductive physicalist. He could just assess that yes, it's physical, but like reducing them to the physical might be some issue. I don't know though that in virtue. So okay, maybe you could elucidate. I'm trying to see where the connection is there.
Okay, so if I did have like Mary the color scientist and she doesn't know what the experience of red is or the experience of any color, let's say she's completely colorblind and she only sees in grayscale.
Okay.
Or actually, how about actually maybe a better way is that she's completely blind in general. Now, you tell her about phenomenon like colors. Well, she's not exactly going to get, and I tell her, for example, that nothing can be red all over and blue all over. Now, the word blue doesn't really reduce down to non-red. So there isn't really a semantic reduction there. You can't reduce blue down to non-redness. So it's one
okay.
thing to say,
sorry to interrupt, but analogously, what are you saying in virtue of God's nature isn't reducible?
Oh, then yeah, the essence itself. So what God is so everything has an essence, what it means to be the thing. The essence of water is H2O, for example. If there's no world where you don't have water that isn't H2O, it's something that has, as you said, a posteriori considerations. You just have to discover more about it, and then, oh yeah, water is just H2O. And if that's the case, well, if that's the case there, well, God also has an essence, but unfortunately, no one's ever looked at God's essence. We can't really experiment with it. We know inferentially.
Well, that has an issue for me because that's to take the first horn of what the issue I'm presenting, right? Which the first horn is like you're saying that the properties of God are good in virtue of the fact that they rest within God. But the problem with that is that I don't see why that's different from an evil God issuing the commands or looking to its nature that the properties that rest within that God and then issuing, what is right or wrong in virtue of that. That seems to be on a par to me. And you're talking about something that morally are on an antithesis. So that's what I don't understand is, and then if you add the qualifier that we can't know, then in virtue of that, you can't know about the evil God as well. So what would even separate how you would actually know? Another way to maybe consider this is to ask the question, like in virtue of what authority makes that the right command, right? Because let me put it this way. Sorry to bog things down, but if you have looking to God's nature from an actually morally good God, right? That is actually objectively good. If I just, for the sake of the argument, and then an evil God that's not in accord with that, but they look for the same reason, right? In virtue of what authority makes either one of those the right one, right? Because they're both using the exact same appeal.
Right.
It's impunitive based upon what they accord it to be.
So I did want to quickly just finish my point with Mary the color scientist. So she's colorblind. She doesn't even see in color. Now you can't really. It would be hard to communicate to her how exactly a table that's red all over couldn't also be blue all over. But you would at best just use some analogies, and maybe she would just get the point there. Likewise, in much the same way she can't perceive those colors, we're just stuck in a position where we're also epistemically precluded from knowing God's essence. But and this is to touch on the point you just raised now.
Okay.
So if you look to like something like the evil God challenge, that's mostly done, although not fully, as a way of countering a lot of what's called natural theology. But that's not the only way we can know about God's existence. The other way of knowing about God's existence is by practical arguments. One of the most well known in philosophy is one done by Immanuel Kant. And Kant basically said that, well, look, there are two things that I basically have the kingdom of ends. I have the end, which is just to be happy and to maximize the happiness of myself and others. But, that could get a little greedy. Like usually when I think of maximizing my happiness, I usually just think of putting myself first and foremost, and that can get a little selfish. On the other hand, we have these duties, and these duties aren't really tied into our own happiness. And in fact, sometimes they cause us to be very unhappy because they put us in a position where we're losing out on any personal gains. And it seems like there's a tension. But if there is a God, hypothetically, then that bridge is settled because eternally you do have your own happiness, which is guaranteed to you.
Yeah,
but on the other,
well, sorry, John.
yeah.
I just want to butt in. But when you even add the qualifier of hypothetically, and especially in virtue of Kant, to me it seems that yes, in a hypothetical imperative sense, you could accord to the goal, but like you're not actually issuing a categorical norm to be like ironically in line with Kant's kind of perspective on it. I'm not sure how you're like, if you add the qualifier of hypothetically, sure, yes, in any circumstance I can grant hypothetical norms.
Right. What I'm saying is I'm positing God's essence as I guess a pretty good analogy would be there are in science, at least in the history of science, there have been hypothetical unseen objects that have been posited as a way of making the whole theory work. So I'm trying to I'm trying to come up with an example from Ptolemaic astronomy. I think epicycles would be such an example. They're basically posited as unknowns, and scientists were perfectly rational at the time to believe in them. And what I'm saying is God's essence is basically a hypothetical posit that I'm just putting out there. It's something that I'm saying that I say I'm justified in believing on some kind of practical basis, and I'm saying that it's out there and it leads me to that conclusion. I'm not saying, for example, I'm deducing it and I know it's out there because I've seen it or I have this a priori deductive argument. I'm just saying from a matter of practical necessity, I'm putting it out there to bridge these two different domains together. One that guarantees my own happiness and the happiness of others, and one that also guarantees that we can fulfill and seek out to fulfill our moral duties. So
sure, Mike, go into a 30-second response, and then we'll go right into question because we're running a little bit behind.
Yeah, sure. I don't know what you like. So to me, you've listed these things that I could cash out as descriptive assessments, but I don't know how, like, when you talk about these normative assessments, right? Like whether you bake that into the conclusion or we bake that into a premise. Like if you bake that into the premise, like in my opinion, the logical way to do this, like, it's Max doesn't want to be hurt. You ought to care about autonomy. Therefore, we ought not to hurt Max. If you buy into that premise that you care about autonomy, then yes, you can conclude that. So if you bake that in there, sure, I can decide upon that. But that's just an admission of like a hypothetical norm of like, if you buy into this goal, then you should do this. But if you're saying it's the conclusion, right, some like categorical imperative, then I can't actually conclude that from the mere descriptions of what you're saying, because like they're still consistent with some evil God if we go back to the evil assessment of it, which is something I want to.
Okay. Right. So we're going to get into the question and answer. Before we jump into that, our audience questions, I don't think that you guys should be insulting Emmanuel with those kind of words. Those are bad language.
I see what you did there.
Yeah. All right. Questions and answers from the audience. James Apperson asks, my question for John, hypothetically, if there is one perfectly good God and a second God who is a mix of good and evil, if both claim to be perfectly good, how can you figure out which is which?
Okay, wait, hold on. I'm sorry to be, I don't want to be rude. So are we not going to be able to elucidate more on this? Because I feel like we haven't had enough time to actually go over like what it is about moral realism. I feel like we've just started.
10 minutes seems pretty short.
Well, no, it's not about 10 minutes. It's just like we haven't actually like had a case for why moral realism is true, and for me to rebut it. I feel like John, I feel like you have a lot more to say. I feel like I have a lot more to say, but I don't know. I'm not trying to be rude.
I get that too. I do. The time constraint is probably the factor that's causing the issue, because these things take time to work through.
Send me a friend request on Facebook, or I'll send you one, and we'll have an independent discussion on my channel. Sound good?
Oh yes, I love that. Not to take it away from PSF. I was a little confused because I felt like we would have a little bit more time to go over this.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And in the private chat, it said 10-minute open convo, and
Okay. Oh yeah, that'd be my fault. That's my fault if that's the case. I didn't see that. I would have I would have wanted to elucidate more on these, but that's fine. No worries.
So go ahead with your answer, John.
All right, so let's see. So James Apperson's So James Apperson's question just goes back to the kind of moral practical argument I was making a little earlier. I'm not saying that I'm able to, deduce a priori God's existence from morality, but rather I'm only saying that if I want these two domains, that is the domain of human happiness and autonomy, and this other domain of human duty, are themselves reconcilable, and I think that I have commitments to both, I'm going to posit God as being the bridge to close both of those two gaps, and I'm going to say God exists from there. But in terms of getting to God's existence, like at the end of the day, if I have some phenomenon of two independent supernatural powers claiming that they are God, well, you can't really do too much based off of that. Most of natural theology is based around making a deduction of God's existence and then concluding at the end that there is a God who is perfectly good, perfectly powerful, perfectly knowledgeable, etc. And it's not done based on just like having a sort of special revelation right there. It's based on these a priori claims. And as to the phenomenon that would get you to believe in one of those, usually it's based upon things like, well, I'll just use Jesus Christ as an example. You would take, for example, his moral behavior, conduct, the inspiration he was able to give, the what he gave as a moral teacher, his various miracle claims, etc., and you would basically build some sort of empirical case off of that one. So basically, I would just take the examples that they gave in Revelation and use the best of my abilities to deduce which is the most likeliest between the two options.
Okay. Before we go on to the next question, I think what we ought to do after the Q&A is let's do another 20-minute open conversation.
All right.
So we can get back into parsing this stuff out and getting really clear and really argue our points. So is that good with you guys?
No, that's fine with me. I don't want to impose. I don't want to.
It's all up to you. I just want to accommodate you guys if I can.
I'm good for the time, but it's up to
Okay.
your guys' time. Yeah.
20 minutes to talk about philosophy. I'm game.
All right. Sounds like fun. All right. So we've got another question from the Brute Facts podcast. Jmike, given the strong intuitive reaction to certain atrocities, it would seem you need a really good argument to overcome that intuition. Do you have a strong argument that you like best?
All right. Given the strong reaction, certain atrocities. So the issue I guess I have with the phrasing of it is that I can as an anti-realist, something I feel like is kind of lost is that I think there are morals, right? I think they're just mind dependent. I don't think there's like an objective fact of the matter. I think it's a weird notion to say like, here's this atrocity X, like some kid is being kidnapped and you stop it. And then you just say, well, there was some independent moral duty that I recognized and I need to do it. That's a weird notion to me. So when we talk about like the intuitions of an atrocity, it's the intuitions based upon mind-dependent desires you have, whether that's culturally relevant or whether that's relevant based upon your phenomenological state, which is something that I argue is the case. I think that everybody argues under a basis of phenomenology. When Christians talk about that they don't want to go to hell and they want to go to heaven, it's directly in relation to their well-being, right? What's primary when they go to hell? Them burning, their phenomenological experience, not their experience of God secondary. It's their experience of their well-being. So I make, for me, those intuitional arguments is that everybody's just concerned with their desires and what they want in accord with their goals. But there's nothing about that makes that objective.
Could I extend an olive branch here and agree with Jmike on something that he just said?
Mm-hmm.
I agree that on if you assume a sort of naturalism, there is something that is pretty odd about saying there are these objective duties like existing out there independently of moral agents. So like this is a kind of argument I think J.L. Mackie makes. It's kind of a queer thing. Like duties don't exist sans people. Like this is one of the things that kind of gets me a little closer to divine command theory over immoral Platonism. Like I get having duties to God and to people, but I don't know what it means for like duties to exist like out there. That seems strange to me.
Yeah,
So
so I'm glad that you said that, John, because if we were to get into the moral Platonism about duties, I have this kind of a similar thing. Is like even if like justice, for example, existed, like how does that have any motivational force in and of itself outside the desires of the agent for me? Like, should I align myself with abstracts that exist, and in virtue of what do I align with one abstract over like the antithesis of that abstract? I don't see the grounding for that in the same way, because when we come down to it, it might just be mere descriptions that we assess a normative value, and then we're back into the same issue of like, how are we deriving the normative considerations in the first place?
All right. And we've got just questions. Question for John. You claim moral facts are properly basic, but suppose I claim that they are not basic, or even that anti-realist views are properly basic. How can we resolve this disagreement?
Sorry, real fast. I want to butt John off. This was a little bit why I was bummed that we couldn't have a long conversation, because this was like the exact question I wanted to ask you about properly basic beliefs I had that are the antithesis of yours.
Right. So this is kind of why I really like the way Avicenna, phrases it based on the law of non-contradiction. What can you say to somebody who denies the law of non-contradiction? It's just so fundamental to thinking and to our reasoning that in order to give an argument for it, it's really hard to actually say this is why the law of non-contradiction is true without presuming the law of non-contradiction in your response. So he says, of course, well, what can you say? Beatings and burnings. Let's just go with that. In a similar way, I'd want to say that, yeah, I mean, if somebody denies there are these moral truths, then it's one thing to disagree in a discussion. But as soon as I start torturing you with beatings and burnings, the immediate response is, well, that's just not my preference. Or, oh, those beatings and it's just not like we're going to have to agree. No, it's stop. Why are you doing this? You're a monster. Like, it seems like there is something that we impugn about a person's moral characteristic. It's not just the fact that they'd like different things than us. We know what it means for someone to disagree with us on matters of taste, like on the difference of food or on the difference of whether or not they prefer Halo to Call of Duty. But it's another thing entirely just for them to go that far in dismembering infants, to decapitating the innocent, to Jmike used the example of slavery. Like, you don't even, it's not just a matter of us not liking them or thinking their opinion is trash. It's a matter of us not even wanting to be in their vicinity. Like, the disagreement is that far off base. It's very much like, it's very different from any other category. And there was also something that was brought up as a gap between normative claims and descriptive claims, but I think that there's also a huge gap between descriptive claims and even other descriptive claims. So there's actually an issue in philosophy called the problem of deduction. So it goes like this: we know that as a matter of deduction, if P then Q, P then Q. Now, how do we show that to somebody? Well, if deduct, you can't really do that, because as soon as you make an argument using modus ponens, like, here's how we know modus ponens is true. If modus ponens if P then Q is true, then P. If P and Q, if P and Q, therefore NP is true, therefore P. Like, as soon as you start showing it, then basically it just becomes more circular and circular and circular.
Well, I would argue it's tautological, right? Because if you just say if P then Q, and then you assert the next premise is P therefore Q, it's just tautological at that point.
Well, if P then Q, it's tautological. If P then true, it's tautological.
Sure, but so no, I agree. I've actually watching a video from Kane B about the problem of deduction, which I thought was a really good video. If I can, while we have the discussion in the time, there was a couple things I had an issue with. One, I don't know that I had a satisfactory answer for, which was that I didn't know if whether you were going to take God's nature as amoral, right? Some people would take like a doctrine of divine simplicity, are going to take like an amoral nature, which to me causes so many problems.
Right.
You've taken an aspect of like that if the good is God, you're essentially saying good is God's nature, right?
Yeah.
And so my thing is that you're just left with the like what you affirmed to me was you took the first horn. You took the first horn, which is that the properties of God's nature are good in virtue of the fact that they rest within God. But the problem with that is that what about the properties of God's nature that are evil that rest within God? There's nothing different about that scenario. It's just the aspect of what rests within it. That's what there's not an authority over the matter. It's what is actually the case instantiated in virtue of the nature. And if God looks into himself and the nature is evil, there's nothing different. And so I don't know that I got a satisfactory answer to like how you cash that out.
Well,
Awesome.
I
So
would,
we can go into the open
that-
conversation and actually pick that up.
Right.
Oh,
Right
I'm
there's
sorry.
open conversation.
Right.
I'm sorry.
I did want to finish my response to the last question.
Okay, sure.
I'm
Right.
sorry. I thought we were in that. I'm sorry. That's my bad.
No worries. So just to go over the response to the last question, the reason why I was just bringing up the whole problem of deduction was just to point out that you could even point out that there are these gaps, but at a certain point, we just say that, look, deduction is just something we intuitively grasp about the world as soon as we just bring that sort of thing up. I think that if there is a problem in a gap between the descriptive and the normative claims, well, we see it in other domains too. So, so if it is a problem, I don't think it's a special problem. And I think if we could justify the first one as properly basic, I don't see why we can justify the second one as properly basic. So, yeah.
I guess I have issues on how that's justified, because I don't know how someone's properly basic belief to the antithesis is not justified in a similar chord. But anyway, if are we moving to discussion?
Yeah, if we don't have any more questions from the audience, we do have one from Paul Kamish that came in. Question for John Fisher 2.0. If you found out God doesn't exist, would your morals change? And if so, in what way?
Well, a few. First off, I wouldn't think it's morally compelled of me to go to church on Sunday, so I don't think I believe in that one any longer. But that would be understandable. But if you're looking for something like that's a little more big, let's see. I guess a few more issues. I guess if I didn't believe in God, I would probably be a little more libertarian in my positions, more conservative based on my theological beliefs. But yeah, I'd have to really think about that for a more in-depth answer. But I'd say that all the beliefs I hold purely on divine revelation alone, they would just be out the window.
Okay. We don't have any more questions from the audience. Then I think we're going to move on into the 20-minute open discussion. Let's go into that.
All right. So let's see. All right. So I guess Jmike, do you want to touch on the question you were raising earlier about the? So I think I would just take the position that evil is just a privation of the good, and that's a bit of an open discussion. But in light of that, I don't think the idea of a purely evil God is something that's coherent to begin with. Like, I just think evil is a privation of the good, because goodness is always something we hold relative to some sort of end. So, for example, human beings are. I'll just use an example like that we know in artifacts. So scissors are instruments that cut things. So I think if you have a bad pair of scissors, then it's bad in virtue of the fact that it's bad at cutting something. I think human beings also have their own teleological ends as well. Human beings are social animals, and if you're antisocial, you're just that you're evil or bad in the sense that you're just not good at interacting with other human beings. You do things that violate conventions of social ability, that sort of thing. So if someone is telling me that there is an evil God, what are they evil in virtue of? Like, what are they falling short of? What standard are they falling short of? If you tell me that God is all good, I can understand that because that's sort of because God is the end to it, or the good to which everything is geared to.
But
Like,
that, so I'm confused because that seems to just beg the question to me, because like in virtue of what, as opposed to the evil God says this is the good, right? They're going to state that the actual objectively evil acts are just the good, right? I don't understand how it's cashed out to say that when you look to the nature within and of itself, that there's some authority to say that that is the right authority of the good, right? Because if the evil God looks to its nature in the same way, essentially it's an issue of underdeterminism. I mean, they both are grounded in the same thing that you are looking at. Would they, or would they not? I mean, what would be the issue?
Right. So a few issues. One, if you have an evil god, that would create a bit of an issue because you couldn't really get Kant's practical argument off of the ground. Like no one would want to posit for the sake of um, harmonizing the end of autonomy and happiness with the end of moral duties. An evil god, that just would be practically irrelevant. But my whole argument has for God's existence, or at the very least, one of the arguments I usually give for God's existence and his interact and where he works in the moral sphere is the fact that he could bridge those ends. So from practical considerations alone, I'd say that that's why the evil god challenge would not really pose too much of an issue for me.
But you would agree, or you would affirm like Romans 2:15, right? That God's written our moral code on our hearts, right? You like affirm that.
Yeah,
Okay,
but you don't need to believe in God in order to know that you have that moral code. So,
real fast though. But the problem with that is that if you affirm that view, you affirm that God has written His heart. This is the issue: is that when you look in virtue of the nature, you come out smelling like roses, regardless of what the nature is. Is my point? It doesn't matter if it's evil, good, kind of evil, extremely good. They're on a par because you're just in accord with what the nature is as the explanation.
Right. Well, I mean, nature. Well, I'm not sure how an evil god can really help you get over the fact that of human need. Sorry, I really don't know how an evil god can bridge the gap between the two kingdoms, though, which is kind of the whole issue I raised up in positing the good god.
What is that? I'm sorry.
Sure.
Can you make sure I understand that?
Okay, so basically, human beings have two inclinations. One, we have an inclination, as Romans says, for the moral law, and sometimes that even comes at personal suffering. So, Peter Singer, for example, is a great philanthropist. He gives a lot of his money to charity. He makes a lot more. He gives a lot more money than it's expected. And he even wrote this great essay, "Give Till It Hurts," which is all about how most people in the world could stand to give much more than they do. And in fact, there's even a interesting thought experiment. Imagine if you have this very nice suit and you see somebody drowning. Would you ruin the suit if just because time depended on it to just drag that person right out of there? Most of us would probably say yes, but we could stand to give a lot more money for the clothes that we buy and the time that we go out to helping people in desperate straits in countries that really need this, and most of us in the West don't. And he basically said we should really be giving a lot more and sacrificing much more of our happiness, and yet we don't unless the matter is just really pressing and before us. But on the other hand, we do have this inclination to human happiness specifically for our own. Like most of us don't make those sacrifices, and even for our own close personal family. So the closest people to us. Now, how can we have a certainty that how can we have a guarantee of our own happiness, and also a guarantee that other people will be taken care of and our duties will be perfected? Well, you're not really going to get it one way or another on naturalism, but if there is a God and there is an afterlife, well, he guarantees your happiness even if you're miserable in this world, based on the fact that you have an afterlife, you have an eternal happiness with God, and on the other hand, you have these duties which God makes clear to you and for other people in this world based on your moral intuitions and your phenomenon. So a God is posited as a way of guaranteeing happiness, but also as a guarantee that doing our duties is going to pay off for not only ourselves but for other people. it's a practical argument. It's not considered like a categorical argument.
Well, sure,
It's
but wouldn't a
Mhm.
categorical argument be what's necessitated in virtue of like
Mm,
establishing moral realism, right? Like, because I as an anti-realist, I can
right.
agree with the I can be an
Mhm,
anti-realist and agree with the assessments
mhm,
of an atheist that makes similar remarks to like hypothetical
right.
situations in some sense, but like that's fine. Like I could agree to
Mhm,
that. I just don't know how like you get to a situation where the error theorist and the
mhm,
subjectivist and everybody's going, oh, okay, there's a categorical ought that
mhm,
I ought to obey.
mhm,
Because when we go back to your answer is
mhm,
that the properties of
mhm,
God's nature are good in virtue of the fact that they rest within God. The problem with that is that the
mhm,
qualifier is that they rest within God, right? That's what's impunitive. But the
mhm,
problem is if that's the case, there's nothing different about the evil God.
mhm.
I don't know how you do that without just begging the
Right.
question and saying,
Right.
well,
So.
it's good because God says it's
Mhm.
good or something.
Right. So this is where we come to a distinction between the explanation and what's being explained, or the fact that there is something to be explained. So moral realism, I basically supported that on things like proper basicality. I didn't really provide an argument. I just said that moral facts and moral truths and our experiences of them, those are out there, and I based it around like proper basicality. So
Well,
that
can I ask you a quick
so
question
the
real fast?
oh, no
Real,
worries, but I just want to make this distinction first. The Now the divine command theory and the supernatural explanation behind all that, that I justified on the practical considerations. So basically positing God, commands, things, divine revelation, things like that. I'm justifying those based on practical considerations, whereas the moral truths, I'm grounding those in virtue of proper basicality. So one is grounded in one way, the other is justified in another way, and they're supported on like two different foundations.
yeah,
So
I'm
so think of it like this: you believe other minds exist. You believe my mind exists. Now you probably base that on the fact that
I don't affirm that that's a justified true belief.
wait, you don't believe that I
I don't I
exist?
no I believe you do, but I don't think that that is a justified true belief in an infallibilistic perspective.
I don't think it's infallible either. I'm just saying like you wouldn't like you don't think you're irrational for believing I exist, do you?
No, I just don't think
Okay,
that I don't think that you can ground Cartesian justificatory
I don't either.
basis.
Yeah, that's like strong foundationalism. I don't think
Okay.
that's
Yeah.
necessary.
Okay.
So, but you do believe my mind exists.
Sure. Yes.
All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. I grant that, but
Mhm,
that's not there's not an issue. There's no like
mhm.
logical issue here where like I'm deriving a value out of thin air
No,
about
yeah,
that.
I'm not saying you're doing that. I'm just saying you think my mind exists, right?
Yes. Yeah.
You're right, and you probably believe in that for practical considerations. You'd be very irrational to go around thinking we were all pea zombies or something.
Well, I could think that, but I mean, even for the sake of the argument, I could just grant that it's the case and just move on. You know.
Right, you're right, and right. So it's based on some practical considerations. You'd be quite the outcast if you believed everyone was like a robot or a pea zombie, or you were a solipsist or something like that. You'd have a lot to cash out there, but no one expects you to have like this Cartesian grounding because that's highly inaccessible. But on the other
Sure.
hand,
I mean,
right?
I
But on
would
the
qualify them probably an epistemic solipsist, right? Like I can only know that I
mm,
exist, if that makes sense.
oh, okay,
In terms of a true justified belief,
right,
absent of like Gettier cases and things like that.
but you think it's at least practical to believe that I exist and that there's an external world.
Yes, of course. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
To your point, yes. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So that's a truth you believe based on practical considerations. But on the other hand, if you were to say if you were to say what's going to be the best explanation for that, you would say maybe some sort of physicalism. I'm not sure. Or
Yeah, but I'm sorry. You said I'm so sorry to cut you off, but when you
you
talk
know,
about practical considerations, I've only conceded to the fact that this is a mind dependent thing, right?
mm,
Which is a distinction when that I want to make sure before we transition
mm,
into mind independency, which I think is the
right,
incoherent notion, which is why
right,
I'm not
right.
a moral realist. So I will grant these things under a mind dependence notion, not
Okay.
under what I feel like you think's analogous to some mind independency, which is the issue I have with moral realism.
All right. So, all right. But my point, right, but would you at least say that there is a best explanation out of all the philosophies of mind about what constitutes my mind? Like, would you say that physicalism is
All
better
those
than
notions.
Cartesian dualism or something like that?
So I've stated in the past that I'm a physicalist and a naturalist. I no longer die on the hill for those positions,
All
mainly
right.
because philosophy has just broken down cherished beliefs that I've had and has made me just reconsider a lot of things. But the problem I'm having, so okay, if I obfuscate from that, please ask me that question directly again, because I'm
Oh, no
losing the
worries.
exact question you asked. I'm just worried that we're getting into an issue of like things that are mind dependent, right? Like that's, I can accord with these things you're saying from mind dependency. I can't from like any notion that's untethered from that.
Right, right.
Does that make sense?
So, from what I'm gathering, you're saying that you're still having a tough time understanding how these moral claims are mind independent,
Well, I'm
whereas
saying
these
when you use the
analogies are mind
analogies,
dependent.
exactly, yes, exactly.
Oh, okay.
Because there's no like categorical normative standard at which like is applied to like how I ought to think the rest of the world behaves. Like I'm skeptical of that, but I'm forced in a subjective like mind frame to my experience is this, and I can go off practicality like you're arguing for, right? But the problem
Right.
is that practicality is not in virtue of mind independency. It's like in virtue of like mind dependency when you can't assess other things that are of other mind dependency, right?
Right. So, okay. So, all right. So, at the very least, that's a good bridge to start from. So, if you're willing to grant that there are practical considerations that lead you to say that certain explanations are better than others, or something is the best explanation, all I'm saying is that I believe that there are moral truths based on proper basicality, but I'm also saying based on practical reasoning, I think that divine command theory is the best explanation out of all of those considered. So I'm not sure whereas I think when you're saying that there's an evil God, what I'm responding to here is I think because it doesn't meet any of my practical considerations, I don't think that it underdetermines it. If
Yeah,
you
well,
understand where I'm coming from.
I get that, but when you go into like the divine command theory, like clearly the good doesn't rest within the commands, right? Like you would say that's not where the good lies, right?
It's
the good is not within necessarily just the commands, because like I could issue commands, right?
Right.
Okay, right. And then if you were to affirm that position that it is within the commands, then you're just in a position of who has the bigger stick mentality.
Right.
And then you're saying it's in virtue of the power God has, which is a descriptive assessment, which can't have any impunitive effect of like the normative thing. That's my issue. But the thing is, if you're agreeing that it's not of command, it's of God's nature, right? You're saying that the good is God's nature, and we come to that as a posteriori consideration, right? That so far I'm right, correct?
Right.
Okay.
So,
But the
God
problem
is the
is
good
that
in virtue of practical consideration, which is a posteriori.
sure. But the problem is that, well, one, it goes back to the very first question I had in the debate, which is that the divine revelation could be false, which I think you denied.
I'm saying no. I'd say that the divine revelation. Yeah, I would say I could be wrong in my assessment of the divine revelation. That could be false.
Is
But what
there a
I'm also,
logical contradiction that God revealed to you falsities as opposed to truths?
and that's the second distinction I wanted to come to. There's a difference between saying the revelation in and of itself is infallible and my apprehension of the revelation is infallible. I don't think my apprehension of the revelation is infallible. I could be wrong about that. But I could be wrong about a lot of things that I think are just inerrant. So, for example,
but if the message is infallible, I don't know how that filters to a fallibilistic assessment, because it's
well,
infallible. It's like saying something perfect gets filtered to imperfection. That notion is like almost I would feel contradictory to like the notion.
Have you ever been so high that you forgot how to do mathematical equations you could do while sober?
I've had more issues with things doing sober than high, maybe, but
okay, all right, but let's just work it. but let's just work in reverse. Then. My only point was just
I
because
know.
just because the message is inerrant doesn't mean the person who receives that message understands that message inerrantly. So there's a difference between what the proposition in and of considered in itself and the person who does the consideration.
So I'm trying to figure out how that's cashed out, because it's like you're saying there's an infallibilistic message, but if the message is infallibilistic and then somewhere along the line the message is interpreted fallibilistically, then it was never an infallibilistic message.
Okay, maybe
Or
I'm using the wrong
revelation.
word here. I'm saying that the revelation is inerrant, that is without error. I'm just not.
But if it's
committing
without
myself-
error, then you couldn't have an agent that takes with error, is what I'm stating.
I don't see how that follows, because there are some people.
Because it's inerrant. It's inerrant. It's an inerrant message. The way that the message could be taken false.
I mean, if mathematics is done right, it's also inerrant, but it doesn't follow that math could be, that math in and of itself.
So you're just making a distinction that there's rationality in the world, but there could be people that are just like mentally predisposed. Like I would just say, as a way to be analogous to what you're saying. There's like reason, but then there's people who have like physical limitations of their ability to reason. You're saying like the fact that there's physical abilities to not be able to reason isn't indicative of the fact that we just like can't reason. Like I can grant, I guess I could grant that. I'm just, my thing is that like if we just admit from the offset that divine revelation could be just false and that you can interpret it right or wrong, then we just back up to like who's instantiating the revelation, and that could be an evil god instantiating the revelation to you. I don't know in virtue of what authority makes God's nature the good nature, right? Because the fact that God has it, essentially what I feel like your argument comes down to, if we strip it as easily as possible, is that you're saying God has a nature, therefore it's good. That feels like the premise to me, because the issue I'm having is that it could be good or it could be evil, but it seems in virtue of the fact that God has a nature from your perspective, that just makes it good.
Yeah, so I don't really see how this illustrates anything too substantive, because also consider the fact that we could all be deceived by an evil demon right now. Like, I'm not a Cartesian for that specific reason, but it doesn't therefore mean that the external world doesn't exist, or or we couldn't have a system grounded in some sort of proper basicality. I think the kind of strong foundationalism that guys like Descartes wanted, I don't think that's can be granted. But I do think that we do have a sort of common sense that, while fallible, is something that is reliable enough to guide us in the world, and we can very much trust to come to well-grounded, justified reasons. And starting there, I think that some of those are just going to be moral reasons. And I think that from there, you just cash it out in what you believe is the best explanation. I just think divine command theory is the best explanation. And I basically said that because of practical considerations that I gave, as well as the fact that when you consider, duties, they typically belong to persons. They're not things that just exist out there, which, I think you sympathize with that point as well. Now, in terms of the first question, I think that just goes back to the point that, I just don't know. I'm stuck in an epistemic place similar to Mary, the color scientist. I have to take for granted that I'm going to make the inference to the best explanation. If some people tell me that a table can't be white all over and red all over, and I don't really have experience of color, and I'm just stuck taking the say-so of people who do experience color, well, that's a bit hard, but I'm going to trust that my trust of other people is going to be reliable on this one. And if I have good reasons to believe that a theory is going to best explain the facts, well, that's just my best reasoning at work here. I could be wrong, but I don't think it is.
So two things that are good there. One is the theory that it's going to explain. Well, I guess let me back up. The first thing you said was like that you almost agree with it, this idea of it's weird to have some mind independent duty. The example I gave is that you see a kid getting kidnapped, you save the kid. Upon a claim, the person goes, hey, why did you save the kid and risk your life? And they go, well, I just recognize some mind independent duty of mine, right? That to me, as a moral anti-realist, is like a very freaking weird notion, right? And it sounds like you affirm that when you say like, yeah, this idea of like this independent categorical norm. But then it seems to me you're just affirming my position, and then the other kind of side of it that I haven't or even gotten into, which I think is a completely probably more important position, is that everything that you're talking about in virtue of the God is desire dependent, right? Like you're not untethering independent desires from God. They're entirely driven by God's intentional states and his desires. And if we try to say that he doesn't have desires or intentional states, I could point out any holy book, whether it be the Quran or whether it be the Bible, and point out intentional states that he has and desires that he has. So clearly they have desires and intentional states, and then the good is supposed to act in accord with that, or the good is that, and therefore the actions are in accord with that. But my issue is like, obviously we've gone over the whole the evil aspect, or the evil, they could just be an evil God, but now you're just in a position of that. I think you're confirming my meta-ethical thesis. I think you are actually confirming a form of subjectivism, because you're conforming the fact that they are desire dependent, which is what I'm saying moral oughts are. They're just desire dependent.
Right. So I do think that they're in some sense desire dependent, but I don't think they're fully cashed out in terms of desire dependency. So for example, if let's say we have a general who issues a command, and the command is, you ought to shoot up the villagers, and now somebody comes along, he's taken to a military tribunal, and the lawyer defends him by saying, well, commands are very subjective. Like what? And he says, it's based on his own preferences. You have preferences. He has preferences. Now, of course, while it is true that you do issue commands on based on a preference at some point, and like a preference to good over evil, that doesn't fully cash out, because a command is actually an action. It's something that takes place in the world, and it's an objective fact that he issued the command. It's not just what happens in the mind, what he desired to happen. It's also the act taken into consideration, which is the issuing of the command, which makes it something that takes place in the world, not just merely in the mind itself.
But aren't commands desire dependent?
They are desire dependent, but they're also an action too. So, for example,
but the action doesn't exist without in virtue of the desire or intentional state.
It's explained by it, but it isn't the only thing that makes it objective. So, for example, what makes it objective is the fact that it is an action taken in the world. It's something that a person does and communicates to other people. So if I command you to do something, yeah, I have a preference for that command, but that doesn't fully explain it. The command itself, like the action taken, is also what explains it. And an action is something that is objective in the world. It's not a matter of preference whether God issues a command or not, even to himself. It's whether or not he issues that command that makes it an objective thing.
Yeah, but the thing is you're just stating descriptive assessments of what God commands. And then if you state that, like, the reason why that cashes out into a categorical normative ought is in virtue of his power, that's some descriptive...
I never said it was his power. I just said he issues the command. I just said in virtue of the fact that he issues the command that it's subjective. I never said in virtue of that it's binding. Like that requires.
But he issues the command and it's objective. Like that is a mind dependent. Commands are going to be dependent on the desire or intentional state, and he issues that. There's nothing that elucidates that I ought to follow that. Like if I cash that out in just a syllogism, God commands X, therefore you ought to do X. I just state that I don't care about doing X. We don't bridge the gap of normativity. And then if we try to appeal to a reason, it's going to be a descriptive assessment. That's why I bring power, because we just say, well, God's powerful, right? Well, okay, there's nothing about God being powerful that is impugnative of the normativity the normativity that's described, right? It seems to just be the exact same naturalistic fallacy.
Right. So So then it just goes back to the fact that it was issued from God, and God has that particular essence, which makes that command binding. So, and this goes to whether or not we know the essence of God. Like I said, we don't know God's essence in and of itself, because that's not something we have epistemic access to. What makes it binding is if we were to know it, then we would just see and say, oh yeah, that would just make it binding. We're just not in that
So that's
position. That's why it
the
requires the
fatal.
practical justification. The
Gotcha, but
practical
that's the
justification.
fatal flaw I have. Like the second to me that you make this statement
Mm.
that we don't have we don't know, we don't have epistemic justification on God's nature, then you can't align that it's in accord with God's nature of being good as opposed to a God's nature being evil, right? There's nothing at which separates that. There's nothing in virtue of what authority makes A right versus B. Good God versus an evil God. The God you believe in versus a God you don't believe in, that is evil by nature. It's nature being, because you are already admitting epistemically we can't know anything about its nature. And if we can't know anything about its nature, it just logically follows the fact that those two things are on a par. And if those two things are on a par, we have no justificatory act saying what is good or what grounds normativity. That to me, that just seems to be a defeater for moral realism in and of itself.
But if we were in a place to know it, then we would just know that, yeah, this is the good. Now, this is why I make a distinction between categorical and practical reasoning. So yeah, if you have some sort of categorical basis for discovering what God's essence is, then yeah, you would be in that position to know it. I don't think we're in that position. But from a practical standpoint, I think that we can posit there is some essence which, if we knew it, would ground moral truths, and that's based on grounding the dual foundations of us pursuing our happiness and also us pursuing our moral duties. Now, moral duties are themselves.
But who's to care that? But moral,
right.
but happiness just sneaks in the value already.
No. Hold on. Happiness is. I'm not seeking the value by happiness. What I'm saying is, we just pursue our happiness. That's just something that all human beings do. I'm not saying that from there we ought to just believe in God just based on that alone. What I'm saying is based on that and and the fact that we know our moral duties, know that we have moral duties, therefore we should follow them. Now, I'm not saying that God's essence grounds why we should follow moral duties. I think that moral intuition just tells us that these are duties we ought to follow. I'm just giving an ontological explanation of how they exist. Why we should follow them is cashed out just on the basis of intuition. I'm not saying because we know God grounds them, therefore we ought to do them. What I'm saying is we just have these intuitive grasps of these duties and we ought to follow them. But as an ancillary explanation of how they exist, I'm just going to give you this. I'm just going to posit God based on practical considerations and give you that as sort of an ontological explanation. There's a difference between saying how we know they exist and that we should follow them, and how they exist, and that's in God's essence. Does that help? So here
I'm trying to cash this out, and like the idea that you're going, the admission of not even knowing or having that knowledge, but you're stating it is an ontological fact, right? There's like this ontological thing of moral duties or whatever that is. To me, that one, that's hard for me to grasp, but two, it's like, I don't know what it's like to start with the idea that like we say Joe won a race, right? And then someone asks epistemically, like, what is a race? Like, how do I know who wins a race? And they go, okay, well, a race is like they run on foot, and whoever gets to the finish line first, they win. And we go, okay, now epistemically, I know who wins a race. Okay, now the race happens and Joe wins the race. And I go, okay, what explains why Joe won the race? And someone goes, well, there's this thing called genes, right? There's this ontological thing called genes that explain that. And I go, okay, but it would make no sense for me to kind of start from ontology and go, there's this thing called blah, blah, blah. And that explains why Joe won the race, because I would never be able to actually like come to the conclusion epistemically that genes were a thing, because I've already started ontologically. To me, I feel like that might be a mistake, because you have like this, you're starting with ontology of moral facts that are also in virtue like an epistemic authority of how we ought to behave, or like how we should know moral facts, right? because
Right.
it's going to align with the fact that you think how we ought to behave, that there's some way in virtue that we know the moral facts, and you're starting with ontology first. That seems to be strange to me.
I actually think I'm starting with the opposite. I think
Okay,
I think I started off by saying, look, we're going to look to moral intuitions first, and we're going to look to proper basicality, and that's how we know that there are these moral facts that are out there. And then I'm just going to give you this ontological story.
Gotcha. Okay, that'd be my fault then for characterizing it that way.
No worries, it happens. Like, this is why these open discussions are really good.
So in that case, then that's. So first off, there's one thing to be said about your position. I think it's of extreme epistemic humility. So I just grant that. The fact that you're going to go, there's something that we can't know, that's great. But my problem is I feel like that epistemic humility undermines actually having a coherent account for categorical norms or grounding normativity, which for me, like, even if I was to say, like, I don't take, even if I was just to say I don't take a full-on anti-realist position where there's no categorical norms. It's just that I'm taking this like agnostic position that you can't really ground it. Like, even if I took that position, it's like the thesis is still incoherent to that person, right? To that audience, it's still an incoherent thesis to me to state that, like, we don't have access to the knowledge of it, yet we can derive what we ought to do. I don't know how that makes any sense. And then how we derive the independent duty in the first place. I don't, that seems to be weird to me.
Yeah. Okay. No worries. So maybe here's kind of an analogy for it. So in a similar way, we start off with mathematical truths. Like, people tell us when we're kids, 2 + 2 is equal to 4. And they kind of give us these nice little visuals to help us out. So 1 + 1 is 2, because now you have 2 objects. And then that kind of builds you up. And then you start thinking more abstractly without any objects entirely. You just start thinking purely theoretically. And then you start thinking in quantities that you've never even imagined, like quantitative infinites, which I don't think any of us have ever counted to. And then that's all pretty cool. But then we start thinking, what explains why these mathematical propositions are true? And then people hit you with an avalanche of all these theories. So they hit you with an avalanche of either moral Platonism or their Aristotelian explanations and whatever. And then you're like, okay, given all these different theories about it, I'm just going to pick this one based off of, and you kind of have a plethora of explanations. Maybe intuition, maybe you think that we're committed to a full Platonism because that's what our best scientific theories demand. Maybe you think that they're fictions because it's just more epistemically humble to say that they don't exist. You could think of a variety of explanations. So on one hand, we can start off with knowing mathematical truths and then just come to an ontological explanation later about what characterizes that. Here, I think we all start the same way with morality. People hit us with a variety of moral situations, and we even think about them ourselves. We even make deductions based off of them. So, for example, if all slavery is wrong, selling John Fisher 2.0 to other people is slavery. Therefore, it is wrong to sell John Fisher 2.0 to other people. Like, you can make these deductions and thinking about morality from a rational perspective.
Well, so that's the one I have is from the deductive standpoint. Yeah, because like that's the issue is like if you could list me 1,000 descriptive premises and it will never ground the normativity until you add a normative premise. Because like when you, and hopefully I'm tracking you right, but look, when you talk about intuition and all these things, like I don't know how I don't like in any aspect of applying a principle of charity, I'm just going to ground those statements as descriptive. Whether you have a Platonistic perspective, a naturalist perspective, there's still some descriptive effect, right? We can have a descriptive assessment about numbers, even if you think that numbers are abstract, right? You can have a descriptive assessment. There's nothing like wrong with that. But there's something wrong with deriving how you ought to do X, right? Or how ought you think about abstract objects, or how you ought to behave,
Mm.
right?
All right.
That is a deductive thing that I don't
Mm.
know how that, because unless you just concede to me, okay, once you buy into the last premise is that we ought to care about what God commands, or we ought to care about God's nature, or we ought to think God's nature is authoritative, then I can't buy into that conclusion. It's not a categorical imperative, it's hypothetical, because I just have to buy into some premise, and then once I buy into that premise, if X, then I should do an array of Y, Z, and A and B and whatever it might be that achieve the goal. Right? So I'm not sure how that, like, that these descriptive assessments that you're presenting to me get you to the categorical norm.
Right.
Does that make
So
sense?
yeah, I'm only bringing this up just on the point of analogy. I'm not saying that normative terms are exactly like descriptive ones. I'm just saying that, we start off with the phenomenon and then we posit entities which explain it. All
But
I'm saying
aren't
is,
those descriptive?
oh, aren't my entities descriptive? That
Yeah,
explain it.
every bit of that they're going to be descriptive premises about what is. Whether
Yeah.
it's abstract or natural or non-natural,
Mhm.
it's going to be a descriptive assessment, right?
Yeah, I think, to be fair to the Platonists, I think they'd want to say it's just irreducibly prescriptive. Like, I think that they would just say that moral truths are just out there and they exist independently of moral agents entirely. That's that's probably weird to you. That's weird to
Well,
me
it's
too.
yeah. I mean,
But
it's weird
yeah,
just in virtue of the fact that these are properties of agents, right? Those are
yeah,
desires from my perspective. So it's definitely foreign to me. But
yeah. So
um,
yeah, yeah, we do
but
share that.
regardless, if you just state that like justice is some abstract at which has a motivational force, it's still
Mhm.
a descriptive assessment of how the world is.
Yeah, but I think it would have motivational force in virtue of the fact that we're rational agents for reflecting on the idea of justice. So here's just one way of thinking about it. Um, there is a proposition that states that how exactly did so my friend Ben likes to ask this question. He says, "We ought to believe the truths of all sound and valid syllogisms." Like, that's I really have a tough time arguing with that one, like with the normativity of that particular claim. If there is a conclusion and the conclusion is itself the result of a valid and sound argument, yeah, that's pretty binding to me, in virtue of the fact that I'm a rational agent, and in virtue of the fact that you're also a rational agent, when you just reflect upon that one. And it's pretty hard to deny. Like, you could deny it in the same, you could deny it and base it out of a practical consideration, but like, even then, if you consider, the I believe it was the problem of deduction we talked about earlier, if P then Q, P therefore Q, then it's a little hard to say that even descriptive claims are on any better or worse a footing than the normative claim I just
So
discussed there.
you would say, like, if modus morons for some reason could be kind of proven with this issue of deduction as like
Yeah.
valid in the same way someone attributes like modus ponens, you're just going to say that kind of, look, there's something to be said about the quote unquote is ought gap that we should reevaluate. Is that kind of what you're saying there?
Yeah, basically. Like,
Okay.
it seems like if it
But
suffers from any problems, it's not on any worse a ground than a deductive claim.
so my problem with that though is like, so as a programming major is that like,
Mm.
just deductively and just from propositional logic standpoint, like I can't have values
Mhm.
subsumed that aren't in the conclusion that way, right? It's like I can't. You said this earlier about descriptive.
Mhm.
Some descriptive premises can't conclude other descriptive premises. Like if I have no descriptive premises about philosophers, do I conclude descriptive premises about philosophers? No. But if I have descriptive premises about philosophers, can I conclude how philosophers ought to act or conduct philosophy? No, because it's just there's a gap there. Especially when if you come in and you say, well, there's this properly basic belief I have in accordance with my philosophical beliefs, right? Well, the other person just goes, yeah, well, I just disagree with that, right? That's where it hinges. It hinges on intuition. But if intuition or properly basic
Mm.
beliefs is kind of like the headstone for it, then I don't know how much philosophical progress could ever even be made, because you're just at a standstill of like my intuition or my properly basic belief is just at odds with yours.
All right.
Right. So
So
there's could I just
go.
say
Yeah,
one?
make your statement, and we'll have
Yeah,
to cut it short after that.
sure, and then I have just one last question, and that's it. That's
Yeah,
okay.
sure.
Okay.
Sure.
All right. So there's somebody I met recently, very fine person. They spent a year just helping families out in Argentina, and just when they reflect on their experience there and the love they put into other people, just even hearing that story, it's hard for me just to reflect upon that and not think to myself, "Wow, this is a really good person. This is a person I find a lot of admiration for and virtue for." I didn't have to come up with a reason for that. It just like hit me that hard. Just like I'm sure it would hit someone pretty hard if they saw somebody dismembering a baby to just stop them and just and even apprehend that person
Sure.
and deal with them some sort of punishment. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's pretty hard to communicate what just seem like brute facts to me,
Yeah.
how just elemental they are. And yeah, at the end of the day, all I can really do is say, hey, look at these other similar issues in philosophy that we also have a hard time justifying as well. I don't think morality is in any worse an issue. I think I think with programs it's a bit different because uh, computers, they use language, but that doesn't therefore follow that they understand the language.
Sure.
We have this just way of piercing into the world and finding meaning into the world that I have a tough time believing. Not saying that they couldn't,
Gotcha.
that computers don't, and I guess that's why I just don't really think you can prove it in this categorical fashion. I think at the end of the day, you're really just going to have to start off with some sort of, like you said, epistemic humility and just show that this is just not in any worse a place.
Yeah. So I'm at odds there to say, like, if we're just going to kind of concede to this idea that really there's nothing that's going to ground the categorical oughts from into like the intuitions in and of themselves, just like that can't, to me it's like the fact that I have an intuition that anti-realism is true
Mhm.
doesn't make anti-realism true. Right. The same way that someone's intuition, like when you use the example of your friend had these intuitions and you, for me, it's hard to see otherwise. It aligns with my intuitions. That's because it aligns with your mind dependent desires, which is the thesis of the subjectivist. There's a crossing of paths between your desires and their desires that align. But it's weird to say that to extract that and go, okay, extract that and say that there is some independent reason that both of you share, as opposed to having similar mind desire dependency. The one last question I wanted to ask you is, and it's a little off topic, kind of similar, is that why do you think the reduction of moral commands or God's nature be any better than any reductionist theory of morality? Seems that if you reduce it in that sense, you just have one more
It
ontological
is a
entity.
Oh no, it is a so it is a reduction in a sense because I'm reducing, our intuitive experience um to some sort of explanatory entity, but it doesn't follow from. And I think that there are other moral theories that do the same thing. I just happen to think this is the best one. I guess I could sort of parse it out in terms like human happiness, for example. Human happiness with God being like the highest form of that, but still human happiness regardless. So I don't like completely write off other naturalistic claims. I'm actually more sympathetic to them than to moral Platonism, but yeah,
Okay,
that's another story.
sure.
Okay. Well, are you guys ready to make your 5 minute closing? And then we'll
Sure.
head on out.
Yeah, who do you want to
So,
go first?
Well,
uh,
it's customary for the affirmative to go last. That
I
way
thought
I
so.
can, yeah.
Yeah, I thought so as well.
yeah.
Yeah, so oh, you got fancy graphics. Sorry. um, so yeah, my closing remark is that I've still not seen how moral realism is a coherent thesis, meta-ethical thesis in virtue of moral naturalism or of God or non-naturalism. It seems to me we still are always going to have some issue of grounding descriptive states of affairs into what we ought to do, and then the one thing that I'm not sure that I got a satisfactory answer for. I'll have to maybe listen back to and maybe maybe I just mistaken the what I thought the response was. But if we talk about, if God's nature is amoral, right? We have an issue, which is not something John took, but if we have an issue of God's nature is amoral, well, we don't have anything in virtue of what we can ground the normativity in the commands, because if we say like, what makes the commands the right commands, and they go, well, we look at as God's nature, well, it's amoral. And John takes a position to go, well, no, we can actually look at God's nature, and it's a posteriori consideration after the fact. But this leads you into a question, because this seems to be a response that a lot of people take as diverting from the Euthyphro dilemma, to say that, well, God's nature, is the good, or the good is God's nature, and we come to that as an a posteriori consideration. But it just leaves you with this question of like, are the properties of God's nature good in virtue of the fact that they rest within God? And this is the point that I don't know that was satisfactory, because the other horn was the one that John decided to deny, which is that God has its nature because it's in conformity with the good. So we can set that aside. It's not an issue. What we have on the plate is that, are the properties of God's nature good in virtue of the fact that they rest within it? But think about properties that rest within the nature of a God that are evil. Well, we couldn't just say that because in virtue of the fact that it rests within it, right? Which is to say that in virtue of it having a nature at all, nature X, nature Y, nature Z, that it somehow elucidates on the good, because those commands or that nature or whatever it might be can still be compatible with an evil God. And so I don't know that I got a coherent response on that. And then the last point is that, which is to my atheist friends and theist friends who take moral deriving normativity as independent or mind independent facts. The issue I have is that it doesn't seem that there's any coherent basis to state that. I don't know what it means for me to do something of an accord to my desire, and have somebody else challenge that to say there's reasons independent of your desire of why you did X. It doesn't make sense for me to say I decided not to steal because there was some independent motive beyond my desires. It seems to be completely tethered to the desires. And until I guess there's some coherent thesis to say, here's what grounds mind independent facts, then I don't know how we establish that. And then if we say that the mind independent thing that grounds normativity is in and of itself a mind dependent thing with desires and intentionality, I think we're just arguing for a subjectivist standpoint. And that would conclude there.
Okay, go ahead and let's hear John's closing statement.
All right.
Oh, and
I'd
then
like
after
to-
John, and then after John, after you're done, I did want to make sure that we did get a question in from the audience. Somebody really wants to ask a question, so we're going to go ahead and let that go, and then we're going to close out the show after that.
Thank you. So to reassess what I've claimed, my claim is simple. I claim that moral realism is true, and I defend that on proper basicality. Jmike has objected to it on the basis that it doesn't really seem to do a lot of the heavy lifting. But at the end of the day, I don't really think I got a satisfactory response to how we can get around other comparable issues or comparable issues in philosophy that I think rest on similar problems. If you are fond of things like the law of non-contradiction and certain things like modus ponens, then I think moral realism is going to be in good hands, comparatively speaking. If we look at two of Jmike's biggest issues with the way I explicate how moral realism is true and how I ground it in natural facts, the first is the look at the Euthyphro dilemma. He is right. My major response here has been that we give some a posteriori considerations. Now, Jmike says that that's a bit arbitrary because we could say the same thing for an evil god. Who's to say an evil god wouldn't be good based on the fact that he has all these properties that are comparable? So would God still be good if he was hating as opposed to loving, for example? Well, the issue with the evil god challenge is, while that is a problem for what I call a divine command theory grounded in categorical justifications, if it's grounded on practical considerations, I don't think the same issue happens. An evil God, although hypothetically, for all we know, could be the good God, uh, would not suffice in terms of bridging the gap between the chase of human flourishing and happiness on the one hand, and the pursuit of accomplishing our duties to other people. So that would be the objection there. Now, the second objection was a sort of subjectivism. While it is true that God does have a preference for the good, that is himself, and not for the evil, that doesn't mean that moral goods are fully explicated by the preferences. A good God's essence is what it is, not based on what his preference is, but purely on what that essence is in and of itself. Just because we don't have access to it doesn't mean that God's nature or his essence isn't what it is, despite or regardless of what his own personal preferences. Even God himself loves himself. The persons of the Trinity love and adore themselves based on the fact that they all share one divine essence together. And they share that essence regardless of what they personally might prefer. And secondly, the commands themselves are actions which are issued and obliging towards us. The reason why we pursue them is because they come from a God who is all good, and again, that is grounded in that is something we know based on those practical considerations. So, so that would be my major response to those two objections. There have been other comments in the chat specifically about issues with quote unquote terrible Bible commands like smashing infants' babies into rocks, but divine command theory does not rest on biblical revelation alone. And in any case, just because the psalmist is in anguish over that, it does not therefore follow that it is a moral command or an imperative. But sorry, I didn't mean to just argue fully with an audience member, but I don't want that point to just stand on its own. So with that out of the way, I think I've addressed the major talking points that Jmike has been nice enough to bring up and worthy of consideration and response. I'd like to end by thanking Scott for giving me some time to speak on his channel and debate the issue with Jmike. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Wes for his great production work and for setting this debate up as well, as per usual. Thanks everyone for tuning in. And as Wes said, I feel that we're all winners for even having this dialogue.
DJ Wicca Wicca Wes.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Thank you so much, guys, for coming through and being so thorough with your explanations and really treating the topic with a lot of knowledge, and you're conveying it very well. You guys, your performance was really just off the chain tonight. I really enjoyed your performance. I thought you guys were really concise and clear, and just it really gave me, and I think the audience too, an understanding of really what these two positions are. And we can really go back and think about it and really mull this over. And that's really the whole point of the debate. For me, debates aren't about really people winning over the other person. I think it's just about the argument and letting the audience, take it all in and figure it out for themselves, figure out what makes sense to them, at the end of the day. However, we do have another question. I want to make sure that if they did submit that question, that we can definitely publish it right now on the show. If you have the question, let's put it up and see if we can answer the question for you guys. I don't know if they've actually submitted it. I did get the request for this question through the Facebook to my messenger. They wanted to make sure that I was able to publish this question before we close out. But I don't think it came through. So what I would like to do then in that case is just go ahead and thank, Josh, Kat the Humanist, producer West, who is our producer. Phil and Sonny are currently our patrons, and we definitely want to give them a shout out and everything. Yep. And Sonny Shell, that's right. And let's see if it's coming through. I think that question may be coming through. I'm hearing. What's the case with that? I don't know. Let's give it a
I mean,
Come on,
second.
Scott. You should just know it off the top of your head, man.
I know, man. I should just make something up, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so it doesn't look like, and I don't want to go too long.
Man,
Everybody's got
hold
stuff to
on.
do, but
just
You
read
just
it out if you need to. I'm
Well,
okay with that.
well, you just prompt me up now. I really want to know.
you really, oh, here it comes. Okay. Question is for John Fisher 2.0. How was the moral valuation assigned to the act of dismembering a baby? Was your argument that the immorality of the act was inherent? If so, how did you confirm it?
Yeah, so I get right. So this would just be an example of one of those actions that just seem very hard to justify, and just seem true to pretty much anyone making the consideration. That usually you just give those up initially, just to get the discussion going because they're very hard because they just seem really obvious. So if you just go with non-moral philosophy for a minute, like for properly basic beliefs, I use things like the world wasn't created 5 minutes ago, and other minds exist, and modus ponens, and I just throw those out because I don't because those are claims that you can take on as rational and justified, and you don't really need to give some sort of justification for them. They just seem like those self-evident foundational starting points that don't need argumentation for. And I think in the moral sphere you have similar sort of starting points. So not dismembering babies for fun would just be one of those actions that just seem pretty obvious to anyone who's just considering the question. Not I could use much more visceral examples, but I thought that's probably the one that doesn't get you an R rating on this channel. So
Hmm.
yeah,
Well,
I just give those up as examples because I don't think they require any sort of assessment. I just think that as soon as your mind entertains it, you're like, yeah, it's pretty hard to argue with that one. Or I also use beating and burning somebody like the moral nihilist. But yeah, that's just because I
yeah, I
don't
get
worry,
the
Jmike.
feeling that
If we ever meet, I'm not going to beat and burn you to change your mind about this one.
I get the feeling that that this discussion we'd need to do a whole other show, or maybe someone else can stream it, because I think somehow I get the idea that something about the controversy here, where I think J Mike is trying to really touch on, there's something not being satisfied here. We've still got something on the table. I think he's
Yeah.
mainly pointing to this is ought fallacy, or gap rather, and this appeal to naturalism. And I hear you, John. You're really, you're trying to explain why, you're kind of making these assumptions, and I don't think that's really what J Mike is trying to get at. He's trying to get beyond that, I think. But we're running out of time. I really want to see where this goes. So if you guys are going to do a stream, keep me in the loop. I want to watch it. I'm sure everybody else would like to see the part two if that's going to happen.
Yeah, I would
Yeah,
love
sure.
that.
Yeah, same here. It probably
would
wouldn't
love
be a
that.
debate. It would probably just be, just a discussion over beers or something, or
Yeah,
whatever.
a discussion would be great in this sense. To kind of reaffirm my issues, it really has to deal with the fact that if we have, if we're looking to God's nature and saying that, that is the good, there's nothing inconsistent about the fact of an evil God doing that. It seems to me that if we're just going to say it's in virtue of that, that is to me just conceding authoritative perspectives of obedience over actual considerations of categorical oughts. And then the other issue I have is that as much as I appreciate John's like epistemic humility, if you kind of deny this categorical sense, I think it's just a form of subjectivism. And then I also think that beyond that, with having God being impunitive over these things, it's just clearly subjective to me. Divine command theory, as far as I've talked to people in the literature and academia, they are all hold this as a subjectivist form of metaethics. But that is definitely a debate to be had.
Yeah.
So
No,
not
And,
saying
you know,
it's
to be
kind of-
fair-
it's
fully
kind of
on
interest-
one side.
it-
But
it would
That's
actually
right.
be
And
kind of
Wes
inter-
did link up there. There's a link to the Discord, so this conversation can continue. I don't
Sure.
know if you guys would be able to jump in on that, and maybe we could.
yeah, I'll hop in for sure for a little bit if anyone wants to.
Unfortunately, I'll be a little busy doing something else, but I appreciate the invite regardless.
Yep.
Jmike, you could probably link to my profile in the Facebook discussion. So just
Sure.
add a friend request, and we'll have a discussion on this sometime in the future.
That'd be great. Metaethics is like my favorite thing to talk about. So
It's a really interesting
it's
discipline.
awesome.
Don't blame me. Yeah.
Okay, well, that does it for the show. I appreciate the audience for joining me and joining our interlocutors tonight. It's a fascinating conversation. It could just go on and on and on. There's so much to explore to really answer these questions thoroughly. An hour and a half is just not going to do it, I'm sure. So at any rate, please join me next week. We're going to have more fascinating discussions. We look forward to it. In the meantime, you guys have a great week, great weekend, and we will see you next Thursday, same time and same place. And you guys have a great evening. Bye-bye.